Welcome to another episode of Uncensored with the Mystic-Skeptic radio show network. On today's show, our guest is Stephen Faller. He is a chaplain who's written many books. Can you tell us about your background and why you're doing trainings and sharing your information as a veteran chaplain with the community?
Sure. Please let me know if I go off topic. I started seminary in 1996, and I think I was the only person in my class that knew he was not headed for the pastorate. I knew I wanted to do chaplaincy. That was 96. I did some field ed, some nursing home stuff. I got into my first chaplaincy at the VA, my first CPE. Loved it. That was in Carolina. I came up here to New Jersey. And after my seminary, which was the typical 3 years, I had a year in a THM, a Master of Theology in Pastoral Care, where I really got to reflect on what I had studied. The MDiv is such a spiritual, intellectual crisis for many of us that we don't even know what we just studied for 3 years. So I got to really unpack it in a THM program, and I began to put together my understanding of spiritual midwifery. So that really defined my work. I finished my thesis in 2000, and I started my chaplaincy residency in Philadelphia, working, practicing, praying, keeping it all going. And I ended up in professional chaplaincy in 2001, actually starting at my first position the week of 9/11. So it was a baptism by fire on the East Coast. I'm not sure where you're located, but it was very intense over here. And that later the next year in 2002, I began working with field education students, and they were working with the midwifery concepts. My materials were not really well written for publication. I was rewriting them. And I got certified as a board certified chaplain with the APC in 2004. That takes a bit of work. And I started moving toward developing my internship into CPE. Did that in 2008. And I'm skipping some things. In 2012, I pursued a grant with the Louisville Institute. A lot of people know about that. And I was able to develop and rewrite my midwifery thesis into the book that it now is. So that was published in 2014. And I was writing other things at the same time. Christianity and the Art of Wheelchair Maintenance was written in 2008, just before the housing market crisis. And but it came out 10 years later in 2018. And still reading, writing, studying, praying, all the things. And that led to my final project, which is how we connected, which is called The Confessions of a Circuit Rider. And so that book kind of ties everything together, and it talks about my ministry as a ordained United Methodist deacon. My disability, which, I don't know what format this will be, if it's radio. But I have a physical disability. Your listeners might be able to hear it in my voice. And it talks about the theme of adoption, disability. I mentioned that already. Suffering, like not just being disabled, but what it means to suffer. Chaplaincy, of course, and there's some theological concepts in there. A lot of times in CPE and chaplaincy, because it so often tends to happen in secular and interfaith settings, there's a tendency to resist theology in the name of inclusivity, because theology tends to be particular, and in common spaces we want to be inclusive. But this is a theological look at those concepts and ideas. So that's that.
Thank you for sharing. For those that are not familiar, this is what I gathered as a chaplain myself. Chaplaincy was started somewhere in the 70s and 80s when people were, it was mostly Christian seminaries. They were trying to give people the ability to become a counselor. So you could become a Christian counselor or some type of licensed professional counselor if you took enough courses, and they made that accredited through the Christian universities and theological seminaries. And then a second opportunity came about when they decided that chaplaincy shouldn't be just volunteers or within the military. It should be in hospitals and hospices, in other medical facilities, and it should be like a gilded profession where you keep each other accountable and it becomes a professional field. And they started the clinical pastoral education programs in hospitals, where we would train for a year residency or sometimes different units. And then it would add to both the spiritual understanding of suffering and the clinical behavioral health issues that come with being sick, and then creating opportunities for people to have a companion, someone they can talk to through their illness or challenges. I felt after my first residency that it was such a gilded profession and such difficult field to get into, that you had to meet certain requirements or be part of particular groups to be accepted. And then people who are not ordained are kind of tossed to the side as, kind of not being as legitimate or something. And this is in all different faiths. So my experience has been a difficult one through the certification process and stuff like that. You
Sure.
being of your particular perspective and situation, did you feel any pushback or any issues while you were trying to become certified?
So certification is a difficult road, and there are many skilled, trained professionals from other fields that try to cross over into chaplaincy, and they struggle. They struggle because they don't have the religious background, as it were. I think that when chaplaincy was starting out and being established in as a major profession, it was thought of as kind of a pastor plus career. They wanted a bona fide pastor, and they wanted to make sure that he had and it was always a he, They wanted to make sure that he had the necessary supplemental credentials, either in behavioral health, healthcare settings, chaplaincy, and the like. So they wanted to make sure that the pastor was a member of his faith in good standing, and that kind of became the basic structural blueprint for certification. As the field expanded and we began working with different religions and so forth, every religion does not follow the paradigm of a 3-year MDiv program. I mean, I have lots of gifted colleagues that are Jewish and Muslim, and they really struggled with this MDiv requirement, this master's requirement. Islam and Judaism are not typically taught in master's level programs. That's a very Western structure. So you saw the problems begin to emerge in those traditions rather quickly. And then as more and more people began to identify as spiritual and not religious, it became even harder for those persons to certify. In my own case, I'm ordained, but I'm ordained as a deacon, which means there are many sacraments that I can't do. Most of them I can't do, and that created problems in and of itself. But certification itself was a challenge because I did my CPE, and I have my 4 units, but then you have to go get a year of experience, the 2,000 hours beyond your CPE. So, I was trained to have my CPE, but I didn't have experience. So I couldn't get the credential, and I couldn't get endorsed by the United Methodist Church. So in addition to ordination, there's this thing called ecclesial endorsement. So I had 3 different bodies. I had the United Methodist Endorsing Agency, I had the APC, and I had the employer. The employer wanted an endorsed certified applicant. The endorsement agency wanted someone who was employed and certified, and the certifying body wanted somebody with experience and endorsement. So all 3 parties involved in my certification technically required the other 2 bodies to move first. So it was a 3-way impasse, very difficult. And this was 20 years ago, more than that, in 2000. So fortunately, I was lucky that somebody would budge, and the employer hired me without the certification while I was putting the other pieces together. Today, the APC has created, and they're now called BCCI, they've created a new kind of level of status called certifiable, or provisional, and you can get your provisional certification pending your time. So they've tried to make adjustments, and they've tried to make um, uh,
Modifications or
modifications and adaptations for uh, other kinds of candidates. So they're a little more nimble. I think they're still in adjustment process because there are probably a lot of people like you that are trying to come through, and maybe it's difficult. Why don't you tell me about you and your background? What's your situation?
so in this show I try to not get too much into the weeds of my background and my
Okay.
trajectory because we've done a lot of controversial shows where we talk about politics or
Oh,
conspiracies. And one of the things that nowadays people would do is that they catch your information and then they try to get you in trouble with work or trying to dismiss
oh,
you or trying to challenge your your studies or something like that. So I don't know if you're familiar with there's a Muslim like scholar. Some people say he's a scholar. Some people say that he claims he's something that he's not. Reza Aslan, and he kept on getting interviewed by the BBC and CNN. And he wrote a book about Jesus, and he would bluff and he would say, you know, I'm a doctorate level expert in religious studies. And then they went back and checked his
oh,
resume, and he was just like a master's level in um, I don't even know if it was religious. It was more like history or something like that. But he had done like a dissertation on the Gospel of Mark, but it was because he was Muslim. Anybody else would have bluffed, they would have left him alone. But because he was a like a pretty reasonable Muslim that was willing to work with different faiths, but because he was very outspoken, they went down the line and multiple shows, YouTube and others, try to castigate him for portraying himself in the best light. So offline, I can tell you all the challenges that I've experienced because these organizations they say that they're interfaith, but they're
yeah,
only interfaith until it's comfortable, and
yeah,
they're only familiar with what they're familiar. So even though sometimes they bring in people from other communities, they have limited knowledge and limited understanding. So I'll give you just a quick example. A friend of mine who studied Jewish studies, and he had a doctorate in Jewish studies. He tried to apply to become a chaplain for the police. And or I think he just applied for it to be a police officer. And they didn't understand what his degree was on. And he's like, Jewish studies. And they're like, what is that? And they're like, religious studies of Judaism. And they're like, that doesn't make any sense. And they're like, why are you applying to be a cop? And he's like, because I want to take care of my family. And they're like, I don't know, we need to send that back and see if anybody can make heads or tails of it. And this was for a secular position. So we can give them some grades that they didn't understand what, how was it relevant or did it mean anything to that person. But usually in a field like that, if you have a master's degree, you get put in the front of the line because most police officers, they have a bachelor's or not even that, they have a GED. So it's almost like being a doctor in music and you end up working at Starbucks. So when you're dealing with religious folks, sometimes there's some of that, what Martin Luther King would call religious conceit or spiritual conceit, where they only know their way, and that's the only thing that they can speak on. And then they act like, well, why don't you just get an MDiv? What's your problem? And it's like an MDiv, like you said, is a very particular Christian program. And it's interesting that where you live is a 3-year program. Down in the South, it's a 5-year program. Uh,
yeah,
and then you meet some folks, and you're like, what were you guys learning for 5 years? Because they don't have as much of sophistication as other groups. I met people who have been through Catholic seminary, and they do 3 years of philosophy, and uh, I think it's 4 years philosophy and 3 years of theology, which is a lot. But they come out almost like a legal scholar of their own faith, which to me that would be the goal. But each denomination has different standards. So the reason that this is important is because in your work, even though you deal with suffering, you deal with the concept of adoption, you deal with disabilities in the work. It takes almost like sometimes like an act of Congress to get the opportunity to be with people who need our support. Um, and you mentioned that now there's a new association of professional chaplains that tries to bring in people from other fields. And if they are spiritual in their own personal walk, they can try to become chaplains too, without having to go back to school and become, theological masters or whatever. So, but it's important that it's difficult to get there because it is such a sacred responsibility to be with the people that need support.
Yeah,
But it also holds back a lot of people that have a lot of interesting perspectives and strong love and interest in others to get there. So it kind of like you weed people out, but you also keep good people unavailable from their
yeah.
calling. For you, do you have the support of your family? Do you have the support of your denomination, or has it been an uphill battle in that way too?
No, I do have my family's support, and I do have the endorsement of my denomination. I would say two things. Um, uh, One is that I look a lot at philosophical and historical sources. I find that very satisfying, and I like to ground my practice in ways of thinking that are very rooted. I find that very satisfying. Um, so sometimes um, my work meets friction because people like what's popular, what's being taught today or practiced today, what some expert has a degree in, that becomes the winning approach du jour. And so sometimes I meet resistance because I try to consider very, very old sources. Um, and so I'll meet friction because it's out of step with what's popular or what's contemporary or the conventional wisdom of the day. So I do find a lot of resistance and a lot of friction, and it's usually because it's out of step with the popular approach. The other thing I wanted to say, I said I would mention two things, is that a lot of what we're talking about now, such as alternative approaches to um, chaplaincy and certification and credentialing, are explored at the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab out of Brandeis University. And I found some interesting webinars on alternative pathways to certification. People who feel called to the work and who connect to God through being a chaplain, like you say, they want to deliver their care at a highly trained, highly skilled level. Nobody wants to make it a joke or play with it, but sometimes it can be hard if you're coming from a different place and a different background and you're trying to connect.
And for those that are still not familiar with chaplaincy, you have, like you said, have to be endorsed or ordained by your religious community. You
Yeah,
have to have clinical pastoral education, and in hospitals they only require 1 or 2 units. In most hospitals they require 4, which are part of the residencies. And then you have to have experience or an ongoing knowledge of behavioral health and spiritual care at a medical facility. So there's so many things that have to happen. But chaplaincy to me, and again, maybe it's a little cynical, but it's almost like an idea that if a psychologist, a therapist, or a psychiatrist walked into someone's room and said, "Hey, let me help you process your experience of being ill," then no people wouldn't feel comfortable talking to them because they would feel that it would be a little too scientific or too, almost like there's nothing wrong with being objective, but a little too dry. But when you have
Sterile.
a minister, a clergy person who comes from the concept of God and love and uh, the
Yeah.
spiritual components of life, that people feel more open to that. And sometimes they'll pick chaplains over social workers because they have had bad experiences with losing children to the system or things like that. And sometimes it's the opposite. I've had in the military situations where they had a bad experience with a chaplain, and they'll rather talk to a psychosocial expert like a social worker or even the medical staff. But the chaplain also serves as support to the staff because the staff get so overwhelmed, especially in a trauma unit or in some of the difficult cases, that they don't have the wavelength to provide emotional support to those patients. So chaplains also give emotional support to the staff and help kind of create rapport and almost collegiality among the different teams. Has that been your experience? And what approach do you take? Because there's like a orthodoxy of the chaplaincy, and then there's like the innovation lab where it's a little more
Yeah.
newer perspectives. And then if you want to go into it, I can talk about how there's also secular humanism, and I
Yeah.
think you mentioned it where it's kind of anti spiritual in some ways and new agey in others.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of really exciting threads here that we could pick up. Um, what I would say is that this concept this concept of clergy is really, really important. And most pastors, religious leaders, rabbis, imams, most religious leaders find themselves in the role of creating community. And so they gather together a community, they educate them in the tradition, and the purpose of the community is largely to transmit the tradition from one generation to the next. I find that chaplains are a different kind of clergy where they're not defined by the communities that they create. They're not trying to gather a membership. They are in these great liminal spaces, these in between spaces, often where people experience great crisis, great crisis. Someone has died, something has come undone, and it's in that in between space where a real clergy person is sought. Clergy have been caring for the soul pretty much since the beginning of dirt. And I think there's a real tradition there, caring for the soul and helping people through these crises that call for a kind of clergy who is not necessarily interested in um, transmitting a tradition or creating a congregation, but rather connecting to God and spirituality in the midst of crisis.
Well, and I even seen people that don't like to be called pastors because they assume that a pastor is a preacher and a chaplain is something else. But now even the term chaplain has become out of style, and they'll say spiritual caregiver,
Yeah.
or I don't even know what else can you call it, because If you say spiritual counselor, they say you can't use the term counselor because that's a licensed professional counselor. If you say a guide, if you say anything else, it becomes so nebulous, people don't even know what it means. The best one I've heard is a fellow sojourner, and that's kind of hippie-ish, but
Yeah.
maybe you can get that across to people. In other languages, I find it hard to define what a chaplain is because it has the connotation of a Christian minister who's outside of their chapel and they're coming to you, they're bringing church to you versus you going to church. Have you come across that?
I
People,
mean, there is a lot of energy around this word chaplain. For myself, I'm very attached to the word um, chaplain, and it's on the title of my newest book, um, Confessions of a Circuit Rider. It's in the subtitle, uh, referencing what I call a marginal chaplain. Um, but yes, there's a lot of debate and controversy around this word. Many times, healthcare departments are now calling themselves the spiritual care department rather than the pastoral care department. I think that's fine, um, in the sense that I don't want to turn away people for the word pastoral care. Although I have a degree in pastoral care and I've studied pastoral care, but this other word, chaplain, I'm very attached to it because it connects with this rich history uh, of caring for the soul outside the house of worship. And whatever faith one is, I wouldn't want to leave that history and that resonance with that word. You could, call a doctor a biomechanic. Like I take my car to the auto shop, I take my car to the mechanic. I could say, well, my body is in disrepair. I need to go see the biomechanic. But I don't say that. I say I need to see the doctor. And the word doctor is connected to a long-standing practice for centuries old of being a healer. And I find that the word chaplaincy has this deeply rooted connotation that goes back all the way to Martin of Tours. And I actually discuss this etymology in my book. And I think that if we let go of the word chaplain too quickly, we make the mistake of throwing out the baby with the baptismal water, so to speak, and we lose more meaning than we want to. So I want to be respectful. I want to be interfaith. I don't mind working alongside Jewish chaplains, Muslim chaplains. I don't need to own the word or restrict the word, but I don't want to lose the word chaplain any more than I want to lose the word doctor. If we want to call it spiritual care, fine, you can do that. That's more open, more inclusive. Typically, the way I use the word chaplain today is in lieu of reverend or some other kind of religious honorific. I say, my name is Chaplain. Now, I know some people think that it's connected to uh, the chapel, but it's not. The word chaplain precedes the word chapel, and I'm at peace with this word, and I've embraced it for my identity.
Are you familiar with covenantal pluralism?
Tell me about it. I'd like to learn more.
It was part of the Chaplain Innovation Lab, and it resonated with me because as we were talking about the secular humanist perspective, there's always going to be a conflict because it's even in bioethics where you say, we follow these 5 rules that are, secular humanists versus religious understandings of life, of, where does it end, where does it start, and things like that. So when you have Catholic and Jewish bioethics, they don't always, jive well together. And then you bring the secular humanist perspective, which a lot of people think that it is the baseline and doesn't work with some of those concepts either. So there's tension, but most people don't want to talk about it because it's too controversial. So they kind of just leave it untouched. But when you're talking about covenantal pluralism, it says, accepting the religion as it is instead of trying to change it, which is a problem that you see with the push to make chaplains who are traditional more liberal as
Yeah.
they're going into their work, and then seeing where you can collaborate and seeing where collaboration is impossible. And that's the real issue, because in my experience, if you came in with a traditional perspective, the one thing that was brought to the forefront is that most traditional religions, they have scripture or revelation as the foundation of their faith. And then the next aspect is your own particular connection with God, your personal relationship, and then your community's traditions, or maybe the traditions come first and then your personal. In modern spirituality, is your experience is first, and then scripture and tradition come second or last. So a lot of people want to say, well, if you have experienced God in a certain way, that has more weight or more authority than the traditions and the scriptures. And for traditional folks, that's offensive because you you go to that as your source of understanding versus going to your own whims and ideas.
This is actually a great thing for us to talk about because this is something I explore and touch on in the very first chapter of the book. And for me, there's always going to be a paradoxical dialectic that characterizes the way I approach the work and the way I experience the mystery. So I have a very specific tradition. I have a tradition. Uh, my tradition has shaped me. I've been blessed by it. It's very personal. It has claims about the nature of God. It has claims about scripture. It has all that stuff. But um, even though it's very personal, it's a very wide mission. It's a mission to serve other people and their spiritual lives, um, which might be very, very different from my own. So I think this question about identity, um, can I have one? Can I claim a tradition? Can I understand God through these scriptures and not those, or through these communities and not others? But at the same time, have a love for God that is so expansive that I'm willing to support and comfortable to support people who are very, very different from myself, who have no interest in joining my community. And that's how I hold those two things in tension. Uh, Um, and that's going to be in chapter 1.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about uh, a love of God that is expansive. In my perspective, um, God is everywhere. God manifests Himself through people, but the personal revelation is in relation to the greater. Like, you know how people say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual.
Sure, we hear that
And
all the time.
one of the people I've come across, they say that spirituality without religion is like having um, like water without a container,
I
and
heard the same thing.
then religion without spirituality is like an empty container.
Yeah,
So if you have the most accurate interpretation of religion is the communal aspect of faith in the traditions and the expression of it as a group, and spirituality is the personal one. Uh, but people say, "Oh, the communal doesn't matter." Then you're like an island. You're like left
uh,
adrift.
no, no, you and I are able to have this discourse because we share a language, and that language is a container. It allows us to share our thought. It allows us to connect with each other, to understand one another. Uh, but I have my ideas and my creativity, which is going to be different from your ideas and your creativity. But we both conform to this container and language that makes dialogue possible. So we might want to talk about different things, but we have to reach for some kind of language to do that. And it's a lot easier if it's the same language, but not impossible. There are bilingual people, there are translations, there are ways to get around.
So when you talk about suffering, do you ever discuss spiritual suffering that comes from almost like spiritual bullying that happens in congregations and even among spiritual professionals where one perspective becomes like put in the forefront and then everything else gets dismissed. And I know that right now we're living in a world of turmoil where there's a lot of pushback and there's a lot of deconstructing of things because of bad experiences and
Yeah.
taking down the patriarchy and taking down known modes of expression. But do you think that we're overcompensating by becoming so dismissive and cynical of tradition and institutions, or is it a good thing and that like the revolution needs to keep on and everything needs to be challenged at all times?
Well, um, uh, it's hard. I mean, I love things that are old. I love traditions. I love ancient writings, and yet obviously there's so much corruption out there. So you can't really ignore or dismiss the corruption, many forms of suffering, as you suggest. And you can have abuses on both sides. You can have people that wield the tradition in ways that are aggressive and destructive. And you can have people that try to overturn things also in ways that are aggressive and destructive. Um, and I don't really like either one of those. I can uh, use scripture, in my case, the Bible, in a way that's abusive. And I don't think that God is glorified by misuse of scripture. And on the other hand, I can overturn traditions and break things also in ways that are abusive, just for the sake of destroying them. And I don't think God is glorified in that either.
Well,
So I really like this metaphor that you talk about this container and the water or the liquid. It, it was introduced to me 20 years ago by a Korean pastor in my CPE residency. And it's been one of the truest metaphors that I've found. Um, we all need water. We all need living water. Jesus uses that metaphor of living water. Um, but it's very hard to drink without a cup. Not impossible, but it's a lot more like a bath if you
Well,
don't have a cup.
well, let me ask you, have you suffered any discrimination being someone with special abilities? Because there's a lot of talk of like, we need to be inclusive, we need to let every
Oh,
minority come and speak and share their experience. But
sure.
um, there are times where you can tell that there are certain groups that are not welcome. And it's
No,
usually the groups that are not well organized or they don't have a lot of lawyers on their side.
yeah, no, I think that we still live in a world that favors the beautiful. And disability reminds us of the suffering that we all face and our mortality that we all face. And so I think for those reasons, disabled people are marginalized. We don't get as many opportunities, and we often have to prove ourselves in ways that others don't. Uh, you know, I'm not the kind of magnetic, imposing, tall, charismatic figure that's going to command uh, a room with a gregarious presence. But I will work and serve, and I can work effectively with groups in different ways. From my wheelchair that I use a scooter uh, to get around the hospital. So I would say absolutely, there's often suspicion, but I think people, so while on the one hand, I have had a difficult experience with power structures because power tends to retain power and hoard power and not share power. On the other hand, when I go to the people who are suffering and who are broken, um, my disability has been an asset. Um, I know that just because you're alive and you've been on this earth, um, you've had losses because no one lives on this earth without going through losses. But when people look at me, uh, I don't have to convince them that I've struggled. And sometimes, if the person in the bed is a sufferer and I come in, they know that I've seen difficult things. They know that I've had adversity. And obviously, I haven't had their adversities. But I think that, like everything, every coin has two sides. Uh, there's always a side that's in light, and there's always a side that's in shadow. So, eh, disability in the professional sphere has been difficult, but not without some advantages.
In the last few minutes, can you tell us why did you choose to write books and disseminate your experience that way? And how can people get a hold of your resources?
Thank, thank you for asking me that. Um, I think that when we put things into language, uh, it helps us heal and get perspective on what we're doing. Um, Particularly in this last one, it's a very episodic book. There are 20 chapters, and each chapter has a distinct feel. Uh, Before I forget, you can go to my website, which is www.stephen, Stephen, hyphen, which is the little minus sign, Faller, that's my last name, F as in Frank, ALLER.com. And there's an order form, and you create an order. I'll respond to the order form and send you an invoice. This is how I would prefer to sell the book because I want to stay in touch with people who buy the book. and we'll have different events, offerings, and things like that down the road. It's also possible to get my books on Amazon, and that's there. But I think Jeff is doing fine, and so I would prefer that readers would get the books from me. Um, I've always written. I think that when I was born and I acquired cerebral palsy, it was the speech center of my brain where much of my brain damage had occurred. So I think most of my life has been marked by the struggle of putting myself into words and trying to communicate the inner experience with the outer community.
Well, we want to thank you for your time introducing us to your works. If you can tell us the 3 books that are available and how can people get I know that they can go to your website, but you also have resources through the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, and what other
Yeah.
places can they see your work?
So there's my website, there's Cascade Press, that's my publisher out there in Oregon. And I'm doing some things. I've written a couple of articles on the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. I've got a webinar coming up. And if you look for me, I'm pretty easy to find. It's not that hard to find me. There are contact buttons on my website, so I'm easily found. And I would love to meet your audience and get to know them and see what they think.
Well, and so now I'm at a better place. Now that I have my letter that says that I have equivalency, now I'm more marketable, and I have 3 years to finish the process if I get hired by different institutions. So that's very
Well,
helpful. And I don't think it doesn't look as difficult as some people think it is. But again, it's like everything. If you get the wrong people on the committee,
no,
you might get put through the ringer, and then you have to apply again. Because there was a African priest that, because his school was different in Africa, he never
mhm,
got it, and I couldn't believe it. And they go for 6 years.
yeah,
So again, I feel like how many people in my position as lay people or as alternative or outside of the US norms in what they consider a real program. And that's what the NAJC did to me. They called me and they said, I don't think that your schooling is good enough. And I said, why? I said, because your program is too academic. We really need you to go to a place that is a little more spiritual. And I said, but I have a certificate in Jewish health and healing. I've studied under major rabbis who are very interested in ritual, and I've done CPE, and I work as a chaplain. Like I did it backwards. I started my master's at
yeah,
the same time that I started my CPE. So I feel more that I was like a chaplain from the get-go versus
yeah,
failing in ministry and then ending up as a chaplain like some people do.
sure.
So I was like, what are you guys saying? And then I had a friend who was Orthodox, and the Orthodox don't get ordained, the females. So then I told her what they did to me, and she got really upset because she's like, I've been banking on this school and being a female lay chaplain, and now they're saying that this school is not.
I think that's very true, and it's hard. And you spend years and years and years. I remember being, compared to you, I was very conventional, very traditional, very Protestant, and by the time I got to my certification meeting, I was scared to death. I had so much invested in it, all kinds of consulting, and I would love to be useful to you and other chaplains that you know.
And this is the latest book that you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah, it's called Confessions of a Circuit Rider. The circuit rider movement is a very Methodist uh, concept, so I'm kind of celebrating that heritage. And uh, um, it talks a lot about my approach to chaplaincy and tradition. I talk about supervision. I'm a CPE supervisor, and you know, that would give you a really good feel of where I'm coming from as a professional. And if you like where I'm coming from, maybe I have something to give you. Maybe I can connect with you and help you take your chaplaincy to the next level, or even just keep going on the journey. The journey is hard, and we pray for our manna each day to get us through that day. And just that alone, the support alone is helpful.
Okay, wonderful. And um, maybe we can have you back on the show and we can do a deep dive on the actual book. So,
That would be so fun. That would be so fun. I can understand, like, if someone is in a parish and they fail and they get kicked out, I can understand why the APC would want to make sure someone is in good standing. But what you wind up with is a very non-standard standard. Where, somebody does a 3-year school, somebody else does good works and studies with a Buddhist, and somebody else gets a lot of grief. So it's a non-standard standard. It's a hard problem, and while there are other certifying bodies out there, there are none as respected as the APC. And so, if you've done all that seminary, if you've done all that education, and if you have all that experience, there's no reason why you shouldn't be a chaplain.
well, thank you again. This show will be broadcast on Radio Free Nashville next Wednesday at noon. And I'll send you the link so you can listen to it online. It's noon central. And then
Wonderful.
in the next couple of days, I'm going to upload it on to YouTube as a video. So that will be available as well. But
Thank you.
I appreciate a fellow chaplain who's working